Hey guys, Spirit of the Law here. In this video, we're going to take a look at the evolution of the militia line in Age of Empires 2. Several times in this channel, we look back at how civilizations have changed over the years, and this is a spin on that motif suggested in the comments, which I think is a great idea, as the militia line have had more changes than probably any individual civilization. We'll talk about these 5 units, how the general perception and use of them by the fanbase has morphed over time, as well as why it took 25 years to finally get things right. The place to start is the very beginning during development, keeping in mind Age of Empires 2 was worked on by the same studio as AoE 1, and often borrowed their own earlier ideas and tried to improve them in the sequel. In AoE 1, you had 2 separate melee infantry lines, the clubmen upgraded to axemen, as well as the swordsman line as something completely separate. It was an interesting design choice that meant a massive axeman you had early on had limited upgrade potential past the tool age. The fact you couldn't carry the same units through and upgrade them later was something the devs avoided in their follow-up game. In a way, this encouraged more feudal play with it, as it wouldn't ultimately be a dead-end unit, but had the drawback of making it very long to tech into if you wanted to switch into it at a later point. In a series of interviews with the lead designer on Rise of Rome and the Conquerors expansion, Sandy Peterson, when talking about infantry in Age of Empires 2, within his personal list of the 50 reasons why AoE 2 was better than AoE 1, his reason number 12 was infantry was actually worthwhile in the sequel. Multiple times, he also fielded questions about whether a technology like AoE 1's logistics, cutting the pop use of infantry in half, might make it into AoE 2, kind of like Karambit warriors, except for all infantry. And he repeatedly said that infantry in AoE 1 needed that, but AoE 2's infantry was, quote, plenty fine, popular and effective, and one of the most popular unit types. I suspect he's talking about more than just the generic militia line here, and probably has some unique infantry units in mind, but there's still a touch of irony in retrospect, given the reputation the swordsman line and most unique infantry units had for decades by the community as underpowered, if anything. In fairness, he may have been right that it was still a big step up from AoE 1, and even having the spear line as a very dedicated anti-cavalry unit was a pretty big innovation. Particularly when you look at the state of the swordsman line originally compared to today though, they cost more, had no base armor of any kind, along with generally less attack, HP, and smaller bonuses. The civilizations who boosted the militia line were also weaker as well, with the Goths who had a much smaller discount than today, the Vikings who had a weaker HP boost that only started in feudal at 10% instead of today's 20%, and the Japanese, whose reload time was staggered, starting at just a 10% reduction in feudal. Celts were the only ones actually better back then, with 15% faster movement speed starting in Dark Age, whereas now that bonus starts at 5% and goes up by 5 each age. By the same token, there was no Bloodlines, Hussar, Halberdier, Thumbring, or unique techs, among other later additions, so you could argue nearly all units were weaker back then, and it's probably harder than it sounds to say how balanced longswords would have turned out to be with years to develop a meta. At least one of the developers, though, seemed to sense that swordsmen weren't particularly versatile. I'm not sure who created it, presumably someone less impressed by infantry than Sandy Peterson. But if you look at your original unit's strengths and weaknesses chart that came with the physical game, notice swordsmen have their obvious weaknesses to ranged units, while only being listed as good against skirmishers, camels, and light cavalry. Pre-Bloodlines, that may have been true in regard to the cavalry, though with 1 to 2 less pierce armor than today and slower movement speed, swordsmen were far from your best option against skirmishers. The fact of the matter is that prior to Eagles, there just wasn't a great role for swordsmen compared to the more popular crossbow and knight lines, as they lacked an extra selling feature like mobility or range. And given the resistance to porting AoE 1's logistics idea of half pop space, swordsmen only really stood out for their bonus against buildings. Part of the reason it's taken so long to make especially the long swordsman useful is just simply they were dealt a really bad hand to start with. With the game out for a couple of years though, and some time to reflect, Age of Conquerors brought with it an opportunity for some major balance tweaks. The first was a permanent 1 base pierce armor added to the militia line that remains today, and just kinda makes sense given the armored and shielded appearance of a few of them, with then a major indirect buff by adding the new Eagle Warrior. I consider this unit a stroke of genius, as it added not just more variety at the barracks, but was a unit specifically designed to be anti-archer and anti-cavalry, while then being countered by bonus damage from longswords. If anything, it's just too bad only 2 civilizations had eagles, as it gave longswords something to really specialize in. Also, in the Conquerors, you had a number of buffs to infantry bonuses, with the Japanese bonus being buffed to 33% faster attack starting in Feudal Age, the Goth discount being 35% starting in Feudal, and Aztecs had free loom, giving them a potential 5 militia rush out of the gate with your starting gold, as well as then the Garland War's unique tech. It's almost impossible to properly gauge the overall sentiment toward infantry at the time, as well as the next 15 years on first the Zone and then Vubli, since these things weren't documented that well. Though by the early 2010s, it's clear the swordsman line were not considered strong in the mid-game for a generic civilization. The main situations you saw them were 3 militia rushes in Dark Age leading into a fast castle, an occasional use in their anti-eagle role, or with champions as a generalist anti-trash unit in the late game. The best evidence for the perception they were limited in their usefulness is what Forgotten Empires did when they got control of the reins for the HD expansions. In 2013, they had a huge list of changes, not just to common units, but every civilization was tweaked in one way or another, as these were longtime fans of the game who could finally implement balance changes which had been discussed among players for years. When the dust settled, squires and tracking, which veteran players may remember back in the day, were both made cheaper, the whole militia line gained more bonus damage to cement its strengths, particularly its anti-eagle role, and more HP and attack was given to longswords and men-at-arms, which were the 2 least used units in the militia line at the time. This was the first of many attempts by Forgotten Empires to specifically target the mid-game, at this point playing it pretty safe, and basically just doubling down on the unit's strengths. Simultaneously though, I felt like the ceiling was being raised with the new Slav's unique tech Druzhina, giving them, at least pop efficiency-wise, the best champions in the game. During this period, we'll say between 2013 and 2016, still by far the main use of the militia line was a Drush fast castle, which was pretty much the go-to strategy on easily wallable maps. The idea was going straight to Castle Age was too vulnerable against an opponent opening scouts or even straight archers, but having 3 militia go forward prior to clicking up could harass and stall your opponent, at least giving you time to wall. It was so ubiquitous that squads of militia regularly passed each other in the middle of the map, and clicking up at 27, 28, or even 29 villagers to feudal those days was very common, despite sounding incredibly slow by today's standards. Another notable change around this time was African kingdoms introducing arson, as unfortunately another technology in an already long line of upgrades, but it did help the anti-building aspect. Indirectly, a lot of new civilization bonuses and techs also started to really help the militia line as well, between the new Malians armor bonus, which was pretty radical at the time, the Vikings chieftains tech in late 2016 giving champions a bonus against cavalry, Burmese having more attack, and Malay could turn their swordsman line into a trash unit. By this point, it's hard to speak in generalities about the swordsman line, as situationally some bonuses became very good, but the community had mostly settled on the view that Drush fast castle and straight men-at-arms into archer play were solid strategies, longswords were way too slow and expensive to be used in any reasonably competitive situation, while champions were okay against trash units, but their utility largely depended on a civ bonus or unique tech. Finally, things clicked in Definitive Edition though, where the devs appear to have decided they were going to make the swordsman line viable throughout the entire game, and they weren't going to stop until that happened. They started by introducing supplies, reducing the militia line's food cost by 15, as well as making tracking a free tech, as just one less to pick up. Supplies hit on a real problem, which is that the food cost of longswords was a big hindrance in the mid-game, but again was just another tech slowing you down, and became a bit of a noob trap, as it just took too long to pay for itself. At the same time, we started to see some really good bonuses for militia and men-at-arms come in, notably Bulgarians getting their upgrades instantly in Feudal Age, as well as Lithuanians starting with 150 extra food, letting them pull off a meme strat of creating 2 militia within the first couple of minutes, for a unique 3-minute militia rush. Also helping thrust militia into the spotlight was a short-lived experiment giving Goths their discount in Dark Age, which lasted about a month before complaints of all-in militia spams had that dialed back. Now, it might have been more popular than I think, but this is the earliest I personally remember seeing pre-mill drushes start to become more mainstream, as in making a barracks prior to your first mill. And just generally between all of this, the militia as a unit in the zeitgeist may have had its peak around this time, so much so that the Celts had their Dark Age speed boost taken away. By this point, militia was less often used as part of a Drush fast castle, and more often upgraded to men-at-arms to lead into something else a bit slower, like archers in Feudal Age, or combined with towers or skirmishers. It's not that that hadn't been done before, but now felt like more the default than Drush fast castle. The next year, things got exciting, with longswords and two-handed swordsmen getting some melee armor, and some of the upgrades to tech into longswords with supplies were made cheaper, cheered on by players who just wanted to see the unit be more viable in the mid-game. Like all heroes' journeys though, we then had a great setback. Things had been trending in a good direction for longswords for 20 plus years incrementally, but then came patch 56005, which you may remember as the big infantry one. This nerfed houses and palisade walls, which was nice for men-at-arms, but then majorly buffed all sorts of infantry unique units in Castle Age across the board. Suddenly, with several infantry civilizations having their unique units made more appealing, there seemed to be even less of a reason to go longswords or champions for the civilizations who were otherwise incentivized to do so. Many of those non-elite unique units felt like faster and higher quality versions of longswords with similar anti-eagle and anti-bullying bonuses. Long swordsmen were again thrown into an identity crisis, being more overshadowed than ever, and if anything, supplies even made this worse by making other infantry feel less complicated to tech into. Just 4 months later, Dynasties of India dropped, and to respond to the longsword struggles, the devs did the one thing they love to do, which was add another new technology, this time gambesons, adding +1 pierce armor and castlade to the swordsman line, along with some other upgrade time reductions, making it a bit easier to tech into champions. Even on day 1, players were quick to recognize that +1 pierce armor mainly helped against skirmishers, and I have to think the original Counters chart creator would have loved this tech. Alternately, maybe he thought they already did counter skirmishers, and would be absolutely disgusted by the insinuation they needed more help. Who knows? It turned out gambesons didn't revolutionize the swordsman mid-game as much as the devs probably hoped, but they waited to see how things would shake out, meanwhile adding Armenians +30 HP unique tech and the Romans legionary as a couple of top-tier late-game swordsman lines. They even quietly experimented in Chronicles Battle for Greece with an overhauled barracks that condensed the militia line from 5 into 4 units. Finally though, we get to the big one, Update 141935. Forgotten Empires finally decided maybe adding more and more techs wasn't the way to buff them, and instead supplies was swapped out for a permanent cheaper food cost for the militia line throughout the entire game. They also became faster, so they're tougher for archers to hunt down, their upgrade costs and times were reduced, the two-handed swordsman HP was buffed, champions gained +1 attack, and arson was moved to an age earlier. What would usually be 3 or 4 years of tinkering was all stuffed into a single patch, along with the new addition of the GN swordsmen and fire lancers under the Eagle armor class, now renamed Shock Infantry, which also helped widen the number of situations where longswords and champions could be used as counters. That was just a few months ago, and the funny thing is, even after that overhaul, I wouldn't say infantry is dominating at the moment, but likewise isn't completely overshadowed by unique units or feel unusable. Drush Fast Castle is still used now and then, men-at-arms openings are very common, longswords feel particularly viable for specialist civilizations, and champions have always been a versatile late-game unit, made particularly good in their anti-trash role with gambesons. It's easy to say the original devs got the balance wrong in hindsight, especially in light of how self-conscious they were to avoid making infantry as weak as in Age of Empires 1, but I have a more charitable view. Let's face it, all of the original unit lines are much better now, whether that be Thumbring for archers, bloodlines, cavalry archers being cheaper now, or camels taking far less random bonus damage, so a certain number of the buffs to infantry just reflect the evolution of the whole game. Essentially, they had to be buffed just to keep up, but other reasons I think longswords themselves took so long to get right come down to the inherent disadvantages of lacking range or mobility, limited ways to use their bonus damage, the high value on food in the mid-game, and to a lesser extent, Forgotten Empire's instinct to continually add more techs to a unit line that already suffered from a lot of bloat in that regard. At this point though, there's no question you see the militia line at all stages, and from a greater variety of civilizations than we ever have. That'll do it for this little retrospective though. Of course, even after all the buffs, the real top tier champions are those of you watching the video. Big thanks to Tanmay Shrivastava, General Anesthesia, James, Jared2142, Niels, Samantha, Shorma Ryder, Siddhant Shah, Woodruff, and everyone else on Patreon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.